You're standing in the corner of a root cellar in the Missouri Ozarks. It's the dead of summer. Above ground, it's 94 degrees. Down here, hanging from a hand-hewn oak beam is a hindquarter of pork that was butchered 11 months ago. No refrigeration, no electricity, no freezer, and it is perfectly good to eat. The entire system that made that possible cost a frontier family about $4 worth of a single mineral. The pioneers used it on every farm in America, and by the middle of the 20th century, an entire industry had a very good financial reason for you to forget it ever existed. And in the 1950s, they made sure you'd never find out. After the last video on the root cellar, hundreds of you asked the same question in the comments. Okay, but what about meat? How did they keep meat without a fridge? So I spent 3 weeks going through USDA bulletins from the 1800s, old farm manuals, and modern food science papers to give you the real answer, not a myth, not a hack. The actual chemistry, what it does, what it doesn't do, and exactly how a family kept a whole hog edible through a year with nothing but salt, smoke, and time. Stay with me because the part most people get dangerously wrong is near the end. Here's the number that changes everything. Bacteria, the organisms that rot meat and make you sick, need water to live. Not water you can see, water they can chemically reach. Food scientists measure this with something called water activity, written as AW. Pure water has a water activity of 1.0. Fresh meat sits around 0.99, basically a swimming pool for microbes. Most bacteria that spoil food stop growing when water activity drops below about 0.91. The bacteria that cause most food poisoning, like Staphylococcus, stall out around 0.86. And the truly dangerous one, Clostridium botulinum, the organism behind botulism, cannot produce its toxin once water activity falls below 0.93 in a properly salted, cured product. Those aren't frontier folklore numbers. They're published thresholds you'll find in USDA and Food Microbiology references today. Salt is what moves that number. When you pack meat in salt, osmosis pulls water out of the muscle and out of any bacteria sitting on it. Drop the water activity low enough, and the meat doesn't have to be cold to be stable. You've simply removed the conditions life needs. A cured, properly dried ham can reach a water activity around 0.85 to 0.88. At that point, it's shelf-stable at cellar temperatures. That's the whole secret. Refrigeration fights spoilage by slowing bacteria down with cold. Salt curing beats spoilage by taking away the water bacteria need in the first place. One depends on a powered machine running 24 hours a day for the rest of your life. The other depends on a rock you can buy by the bag. And the gap between those two approaches is worth tens of billions of dollars a year. Hold that thought. The pioneers didn't know the phrase water activity. They didn't need to. They'd inherited 2,000 years of trial and error, and they'd refined it into a routine so reliable they bet their families' winter survival on it every single year. Here's how it actually worked on a homestead. Hogs were slaughtered in late autumn, and the timing was not sentimental, it was scientific. They waited for the first hard, cold snap because the meat had to be kept near freezing during the first weeks of curing, while the salt did its slow work and before spoilage could get a head start. Cold weather was the pioneer's refrigerator for exactly the window when he needed one. Then came the salt. For a dry cure, they'd rub the meat heavily, roughly half an ounce to an ounce of salt per pound, and pack it skin side down in a wooden box or a stoneware crock. Often they'd mix in a little brown sugar to soften the harshness and feed the flavor, and saltpeter, potassium nitrate, for color and, though they didn't know the term, an extra layer of protection against botulism. The meat sat in that salt roughly a day and a half to 2 days per pound of thickness. A big ham might cure for a month or more. After curing, they hung it. And this is where the spring house and the smokehouse came in. The meat was smoked slowly over a smoldering hardwood fire, hickory, oak, applewood, for days. Smoke does 3 things at once. It dries the surface further. It coats the meat in natural compounds called phenols that slow bacteria and rancidity, and it makes the outside inhospitable to the mold and insects that would otherwise move in. Then the ham hung in the smokehouse or cellar, wrapped in cloth or paper, sometimes packed in ash or cloth bags to keep flies off, aging for months. The famous country hams of Virginia and Kentucky, the genuine article, were aged a year or more this way. This isn't tradition. It's applied food chemistry, refined over a century of people who could not afford to be wrong. Now, let me be honest with you, because the channels that aren't honest with you are the ones that get people hurt. 2 years is the far edge of what a properly aged country ham can reach, and only a whole muscle cut, fully cured, properly dried, kept cool and dry the entire time. It was never the everyday number. A more typical pioneer ham was eaten within 6 months to a year, and the margin for error was real. A cure that was too light, a winter that was too warm, a piece cut too thick for the salt to reach the center, and a family could lose the meat, or worse. They respected this process precisely because it could fail. We should too. So, if this worked for 2,000 years, why has almost nobody under 60 ever cured a ham? Why did the knowledge vanish from American kitchens in a single generation? Follow the money. In 1913, a man named Fred Wolf built one of the first electric home refrigerators, the Domora, the domestic electric refrigerator in Chicago. By 1927, General Electric launched the Monitor Top, the first refrigerator to sell in serious numbers. And here's the pivot point. In 1916, fewer than the average American home had any mechanical refrigeration at all. By 1944, about 85% of American homes had a refrigerator. That is one of the fastest adoptions of any appliance in history. And it did not happen by accident. It happened because the appliance industry, working hand in hand with the new electric utilities, ran one of the most effective marketing campaigns of the 20th century. Utilities had a problem. They'd built enormous generating capacity, and demand sagged in the daytime. A refrigerator runs all day, every day, forever. It was, from the utility point of view, the perfect customer, a machine that never stopped buying electricity. So, General Electric, Frigidaire, Westinghouse, and the power companies poured money into convincing American families that the old ways were not just outdated, they were dirty, dangerous, backward. Cured and smoked meats were reframed in advertising and in the new home economics curricula as primitive, the food of people who couldn't afford to be modern. the salt box and the smokehouse became a symbol of poverty, and the gleaming white refrigerator became a symbol of having made it. And there's a real public health thread woven into this, which is why it worked so well. Refrigeration genuinely did reduce certain foodborne illnesses, especially for milk and fresh meat. That part is true, and I won't pretend otherwise. But the campaign didn't say refrigeration is better for these specific perishable foods. It said the old methods were obsolete, full stop, and quietly buried a 2,000-year-old body of knowledge that worked perfectly well and cost almost nothing to run. By the 1950s and 60s, home curing had collapsed. It survived in pockets. Appalachia, rural farm families, a few stubborn holdouts. But for most of the country, an entire skill that every grandmother once possessed disappeared inside of about 30 years. Not because it failed, because there was no profit in a method that runs on a $4 bag of salt instead of a meter that spins for the rest of your life. Now, if you're sitting there thinking this is interesting history, but it has nothing to do with your life, stay with me, because this next part is specifically for you. You don't need a farm. You don't need a smokehouse. You don't need to slaughter a hog. You don't need to tear anything out of your kitchen or give up your refrigerator. The refrigerator is genuinely good at what it does, and nobody's asking you to unplug it. What I'm offering you is the thing your grandmother had that you don't. Independence from the machine. The knowledge that if the power goes out for a week, if the grid goes down, if you simply want to preserve a side of pork you bought on sale without it sitting in a freezer for a year tasting like ice, you have a method that has worked for 2 millennia and costs almost nothing. You need a cool space, a basement, a cellar, even a refrigerator for the curing stage if you want to be cautious, which I'd actually recommend for a beginner. You need salt, you need a little patience, and you need to respect the process, because the same chemistry that preserves your meat will, if you cut corners, let something dangerous grow. I'm going to walk you through it the careful way, the way that gives you the old knowledge without the old risks. Here's the method, the way a careful modern homesteader does it. I'm going to start with bacon because it's the most forgiving cut to learn on. Start with a slab of pork belly, say 5 pounds. Your materials: coarse salt, brown sugar, and this is the one non-negotiable, a curing salt that contains sodium nitrite, usually sold as Prague powder number 1 or pink curing salt. It's dyed pink so you never confuse it with table salt. This is the single most important safety step in the entire process, because nitrite is what specifically prevents botulism in cured meat. The pioneers used saltpeter for the same purpose without understanding the mechanism. We understand it now, so we use the precise measured version. A bag costs a few dollars and lasts you years. The ratio matters, so measure by weight, not by eye. A common, well-tested cure is roughly 2% salt, 1% sugar, and exactly 0.25% pink curing salt. That's about a quarter teaspoon of pink salt per 5 pounds of meat. Do not freelance the curing salt amount. More is not safer. Nitrite has its own toxicity at high doses. Measure it. Mix your cure. Rub it over every surface of the belly. Put it in a sealed bag or a non-reactive container and put it in the refrigerator, not the cellar. the refrigerator at refrigerator temperature for 7 days, flipping it once a day. The cold here does the same job the pioneer's autumn cold snap did. It keeps the meat safe while the cure penetrates. After 7 days, rinse it, pat it dry, and let it sit uncovered in the fridge overnight to form a tacky surface called a pellicle. Then, if you want the traditional flavor, cold smoke it over hardwood, or simply roast it slowly in a low oven to an internal temperature of 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Slice it. That's bacon, real bacon, the way it was made before plastic packages. Total cost of the curing materials for that batch, about $4. The same $4 that kept a pioneer family alive through winter. Now, whole hams, 2-year country hams, dry-cured sausages. Those are a real craft with real risk, and they deserve more than a paragraph. I've put together a complete guide, every cut, every ratio, the temperature and humidity targets, the safety checks, the full pioneer preservation system, curing, smoking, root cellaring, the works, all in one place. The link is in the description. But stay here, because what I'm about to show you is the part that proves none of this was ever a frontier accident. Let me tell you about a man I'll call Dale in rural Tennessee, because his story is the one that made me want to make this video. Dale is 61. He grew up watching his grandfather hang hams in a smokehouse, and then he spent 40 years, like the rest of us, buying everything shrink wrap from a grocery store. 3 years ago, his chest freezer died during an ice storm, and he lost almost $400 of meat in a single weekend, sitting helpless while it thawed. That was the moment he decided to relearn what his grandfather knew. He cleaned out a corner of his cellar where the temperature holds in the low 50s most of the year. He started with bacon, then moved to whole hams. He keeps a simple log, cure weight, dates, the cellar temperature. Here are his real numbers before he ran 2 chest freezers around the clock. He estimates they added roughly $35 to $40 a month to his electric bill, year-round. Today, he runs one small freezer for the things that genuinely need it and cures the rest. His curing supplies cost him under $50 for an entire year of meat. And his words, the bigger thing isn't the money. It's that when the next ice storm knocks the power out, his food just hangs there in the dark, exactly like it did for his grandfather, not caring one bit that the grid is down. He didn't beat the refrigerator. He just stopped being completely dependent on it. And here's what tells you this was never a trick, never a fad, never folklore. Every civilization that ever needed to survive without refrigeration arrived at exactly the same answer, completely independently. Go back 5,000 years to ancient Egypt. They salted and dried fish and poultry on a massive scale. Preserved birds have been found in tombs, cured for a journey into an afterlife they expected to last forever. They understood, without any chemistry, that salt held off decay. The Romans built an empire partly on salt. The word celery comes from the Latin for salt. Roman soldiers were connected to a salt allowance. Roman armies marched on salted pork and dried provisions, because you cannot conquer the Mediterranean if your food rots in a week. Their writer, Cato the Elder, left detailed instructions for salting hams that read almost exactly like an Appalachian recipe 2,000 years later. In China, Fermented and salt-cured meats and fish go back thousands of years. Jinhua ham has been made by essentially the same method for over 1,000. In the mountains of Italy and Spain, prosciutto and jamon are still made today the old way. Salt, air, time, and patience. Some aged 3 years or more, sold for hundreds of dollars, prized precisely because no machine was involved. The Inuit of the Arctic and the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest dried and smoked salmon to carry them through winters that would kill an unprepared family. The Andean peoples freeze-dried potatoes and made charqui, dried meat, the word that gave us jerky. Egypt, Rome, China, Italy, Spain, the Arctic, the Andes, the American frontier. Not one of them talked to the others. Not one of them had a textbook. And every single one of them, faced with the same problem, reached for the same two things: salt and the patience to let nature do the rest. That is not a coincidence. That is a law of the physical world, as reliable as gravity. Salt removes water. Without water, decay cannot proceed. It was true in the tombs of the pharaohs, and it is true in a cellar in Tennessee tonight. The refrigerator is a wonderful machine, but it is a machine, and a machine can be sold to you, metered, financed, and replaced every 15 years. Salt cannot. Salt sits in a bag in your pantry asking nothing of you, owned by no one, the same mineral the pharaohs used. The industry didn't lose this knowledge. It simply made sure that when you reached for a way to keep your food, the only answer you'd ever been taught to see was the one with a plug on it. So here's where we stand. For 2,000 years, every family that needed to survive a winter knew how to do this. Then, in about 30 years, one of the most aggressive marketing campaigns in American history convinced a whole country that the knowledge was beneath them. They didn't lose this knowledge. You were just never given it. Now you have it. Use it carefully. Respect the chemistry. Start with bacon. Measure your cure. Keep it cold while it works. And never skip the curing salt. Do that, and you're holding a skill your great-grandparents would have recognized in an instant. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment with your state and tell me one thing. Did anyone in your family, a grandfather, an aunt, somebody back the line, ever keep a smokehouse, a salt box, or a root cellar? I read these, and the stories you leave are how I find the next method to dig up. And if you're the kind of person who's starting to suspect that a lot of old-fashioned knowledge was quietly pushed aside to sell you a machine, subscribe, because next week I'm going down a different hole entirely. The pioneers kept butter and milk fresh through summer heat without a single block of ice, using nothing but a clay pot, a little water, and a principle of physics that the dairy and appliance industries spent the 20th century making sure you'd never think to use. It costs about $2. It still works today. And the reason you've never heard of it is a story you need to hear.